When I started, my kids were very small and I started doing alteration and custom sewing and hems and lots of zippers. But in that, I had a loyal group of women who came to me regularly, and in Pequot, which is seasonal, everything goes on sale in the fall because the summer tourist season is over, and they would buy a whole back seat or trunk load of clothes, no matter what size they were, because Karen could fix them. And they would come and bring in these piles of clothes and try them on one after another, and we'd pin them and I'd make them fit. And that was an incredible education. So when I started making patterns, I could make things that fit and I could size them to every size. We've been doing organic cotton since 96. Had, I think, 6 or 7 of the big mills that either decided not to do organic, or they bankrupt, or they reorganized, or they did something, and so it's, always looking for who's picking it up next. Some of the boxes now are filled with scraps that I use for making rugs, but all the ones in the back are still fabric that hasn't been washed or dyed, so it's still raw materials. I start with patterns, and I've got like my craft paper patterns on the hangers here. I design something usually in my size, and then I can lay out the paper and I can make smaller and larger sizes, and then I pre-shrink the fabric and dye the colors, and I cut out a lot of things after they're dyed because then I have colored scraps for the rugs. But then there's some things like knits that completely roll up into little rolls, and you want to cut that before and just figure this is going to shrink 4 inches and that's going to shrink 7 inches, and you add that to the patterns and you cut it out ahead of time. The ones that shrink, that's in length. The one that shrinks in width, you can't set sleeves, you can't do anything with it, you have to pre-shrink it if it's going to shrink in the width. So. Yeah, I like to do one-of-a-kind pieces, but our bread and butter is now the Renaissance, and so I make stacks of things. Well, the reason we have all these machines in this big space is we started out doing wholesale, and that lasted about 3 years, and I really don't like having a lot of other people sewing my thing. It's daily disasters and watching people sew slower than I can sew, and it's I really would rather do the retail and the art fairs that say everything has to be your own work, and then other than those 3 years, we quit that in like 2000. All of these bodices were cut out of the scraps from making capes and cloaks and coats out of it first, and then ending up with smaller pieces. So occasionally I'll take a great big piece and make little things out of it, but in the course of making a lot of capes, there were whole boxes of little pieces. And we've been doing the Minnesota Renaissance. We've done it 7 years now, and we started out doing some organic conferences and sustainable living fairs and energy fairs, and then added some art fairs to it, and then I would make like one-of-a-kind fabulous pieces for art fairs, and they would actually sell at the organic conference instead. At first when we applied, we got into everything, and then some of them decide, oh, it's clothing, that's not oil colors, and it's not pottery. And so we would be paying all the jury fees and not getting into a lot of them, and it seemed like the higher the gas prices get, the lower the amount of stuff that people buy at art fairs. But the Renaissance Fair, that's a vacation, and people go on vacation and they spend money, and we're doing fabulously well at the Renaissance.
Everything.
I like having time where nobody's going to ask me to do anything, and I can make something new, make something one of a kind. And it's kind of like playing, like, oh, I should get orders done and I should have inventory ready, but you take time just to do the one-of-a-kind pieces that, if you don't do one-of-a-kind pieces, then you have no ideas for them. And when you start on one, then you go, ooh, I could do one this way and that way and in these colors, and every time you do something creative, you have ideas for 3 more. I use Procyon dye. It's a synthetic dye made in France, and it's a commercial, good quality dye. that lasts through many, many washings. You can bleach it or, leave it in the sun for too long and it will fade some, but for regular washing and wearing, it really lasts a long time. And it's low impact, which means it doesn't use a lot of water, and non-toxic, so it's approved for organic cotton. There's a lot of things that organic cotton doesn't approve of, like formaldehyde sizings and dyes with heavy metals and bleach. Have to have 2 different dye recipes because they're not going to turn out the same color. So I'll have here sage to match the blanket, number 9, and it says knit. So it's and some things get dyed more than once, and sometimes it's a lucky match where you end up with a knit that exactly matches something and you go, wow, I'm good. Other times you do 10 different recipes of a dye and you say, this was difficult. It was done, I took construction paper and I folded it in half and I freeform cut it, and then I weighted it down with a sheet of glass and shined the light on it so that I had a symmetrical tree. And then some of them are I've done like for the organic conference, and that I do on the computer, and I do it in their font. They'll email it to me. Rugs and buttons kind of come into evening time, where I spend like a full day sewing, and then when we sit down to watch a little TV in the evening, then my loom is in the living room, and sometimes, my evening time is broken up between hand sewing, like when I have a lot of buttons to sew on, and weaving, and we're using stoneware clay. These are some of the buttons. Oopsie, I'm missing one here again. But that's a recycled thing too. Working with the school, they have, when they clean up, rather than putting all the little pieces down the drain, they put it into a slip bucket. And then when you pour the water off after it settles, you have all of this clay that's been used and reused. We did wholesale first, and I had sales reps. And they wanted me to be a success, so there was a man, and he was out in Connecticut. And so I never actually met him, but through him I had suddenly 6 other sales reps all on the East Coast, and they were doing the commercial shows, the big fashion shows, and I was getting orders from them. So his formula was to divide things into 3 for wholesale price, and 1/3 was fabric and materials, and 1/3 was labor, and 1/3 was overhead and profit. And then the retail price doubled that, and that covers booth fee or store, the store overhead or whatever. So I can kind of look at something and say, the fabric for this is going to be a lot more expensive for the labor. Say it's a big cape, but you just hem it. And, you can fudge a little bit on the formula of dividing things in halves and thirds. But it's worked very well. And then there are some things like the tabards that probably take a little more time, and men's shirts, which take a lot more time. But you can't get $150 for them, but you can get 80. And you can sell quite a few at 80, and then they'll buy something else too. So there are some things that I make much better on, and there are some things that it's barely worth making, but it keeps people coming in. There was someone we knew through friends in Pine River, which is just 10 miles away, and she contacted me and she says, well, Jill is going to graduate high school and wants to go to the Institute of Art and learn fashion design, and I think it'd be really a good idea for her to learn to sew. She doesn't know how to sew. And so I took her in as an intern, and she worked, 2 weeks, and I started paying her.
Yeah.
She was very good. So I employed her for 2 summers, and I went through making patterns and sizing them with her, and how to do it, and the sewing, and dyeing, and screen printing, and we did all sorts of stuff, in the course of the 2 years. And I let her do some designing and, make some things of her own for herself to keep. And she went on to do the design school. She was the first one in her class to get employment, and she's an assistant fashion consultant for Target in her first job. And I'm really proud of her. She was very good. And we've done a lot of volunteer work too, with church and with community groups and sustainable farming. And we were talking this morning about what makes a successful artist, and probably just pleasure in doing what you're doing is one thing. And for us, we've gotten awards for our environmental stewardship from 2 different governors, and we take a lot of pride that it's, you know, American made and that it's good for everyone. But one thing that we were thinking of is that we've been in business for 30 years, and aside from small part-time jobs and you know, occasional Chuck chaired meetings and got honorariums for that, and we've done some speaking and that sort of thing, odd jobs. We have both made our living entirely off the sewing business.